Welcome again. This is Jason Grillo of the AirMiners. Glad to see that we have so many participants for our first of what could be potentially multiple MRV events about monitoring, verification, and reporting in carbon removal. What I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of the ground rules about how we operate. We have a little bit about how this event came into play, and then we'll pass it, and I'll pass it along to Naeem Merchant, our moderator, who will introduce, and we'll go from there for the panel discussion. So this event came about because we are in AirMiners interested in engaging our community. And a little bit of time ago, I put up a poll in AirMiners saying, what do we want to have for our next August event? What bubbled up by far was an event on monitoring, verification, and reporting. So we want to engage with our community, engage with the way that we want to stay at the cutting edge of developments in carbon removal. MRV is clearly in need and something that we wanted to bring about. Since so many of you are new and we've had an incredible amount of registration of interest in this event, I'll just explain a little bit about the run of the show today. First, I'll talk a little bit, send it to Naeem. We'll have panel discussion for maybe 40-45 minutes, followed by audience Q&A. So at that point, Tito Jankowski and I will sift through the questions. Hey, Tito. And we will cull the most interesting ones to ask of the panel at that point. We'll do that till basically the top of the hour, stop, and then stop the recording, but we'll keep in Zoom so that, and for half an hour or so afterwards, we'll have Zoom breakout rooms for those of you who want to stick around for a little bit and network. We're all extraordinarily busy. Please do not feel obligated to remain for that, but it's a really good way of digesting what the panel had discussed and also getting to know each other better, not just know of each other. So the semantics make sense. A couple of do's and don'ts. Do please mute yourselves so that we don't get background noise while we're having our event today. Also, a couple of don'ts. Just to note, in AirMiners, we don't do slides. We're going to get right to the heart of the matter, which is a conversation among our panelists. Another don't is we also don't talk about Bruno. So there's a couple people got it. So there's that. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Naeem Merchant, who's the founder and managing director of Carbon Curve, a consultancy focused on scaling up the carbon removal industry and publisher of the Carbon Curve newsletter and podcast. So Naeem, please take us away.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Jason. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Before I introduce today's panel, I wanted to say I'm really excited to dig into measurement or monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, with you all. Jason mentioned to me that today's event is one of the highest registration counts for an AirMiners event. So it's clear that a lot of you have MRV on the mind. And that makes a lot of sense. I recently had the chance to have Peter Reinhardt from Charm Industrial on my podcast a few weeks ago. And he said something that really struck me. He said, you don't show up to a loading dock and make a delivery of carbon removal. The activity is that we sequester carbon, but the product is that we measure, report, and verify that carbon removal is happening and it's going to stay there. So you can kind of think of MRV as the product. I also had the opportunity to work on a report with Carbon Plan on barriers to scaling up the carbon removal industry recently. And one of the key findings was that carbon removal companies across the board saw, getting standards that include MRV right as being essential to being kind of building a long-term degree of trust in the CDR ecosystem, which is necessary to attract the next wave of CDR buyers. So MRV is the product, and the stakes are high that we get this right. With that in mind, and with the amazing panel that Jason and Tito have expertly assembled today, I wanted our discussion to touch on three major themes. First, big picture. What problem is MRV trying to solve? And what does a good MRV system look like? Second, governance. who should design MRV protocols and who should decide what's good enough? And finally, quality. How do we improve MRV quality, especially where it's presently weak? We're not going to solve all of these problems in our discussion today, obviously, but these macro questions are absolutely fundamental to work through in order to get MRV right. And I know that we're planning to do a sequel event on this where we can get into maybe more pathway specific issues, but for any MRV initiative or technology to work, it needs to work within a well-functioning system. And so that's what we'll talk about today. So without further ado, let's have our panel introduce themselves. And I'll just call them out alphabetically here, briefly starting with Bertha.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be part of this panel. So I'm Berta Moya. Just as a quick background, my background is in biochemical and environmental engineering, and I have a PhD in soil science. I ended up working in the biochar sector for the last 4 or 5 years, which eventually led me into the CDR world. And now I'm part of Carbon Future since the beginning of this year. And Carbon Future is a digital platform and a marketplace dedicated to carbon removal, which enables the tracking, documentation, and measurement of carbon removals. And I've been leading the Catalyst program, which aims to accelerate the scale up of carbon removal companies, like supporting them in the carbon accounting methodologies and MRV plans for them to develop them. So for us, MRV is a very key part, and yeah, very happy to be here.
Thanks, Bertha. Kara.
Okay, thanks. Hi, everybody, and thanks to Jason and Tito and AirMiners for having me. Thanks, Naeem, for moderating. My name is Kara Maizano. I'm normally based in Paris. I have a background in particle physics, specifically in detector development, but also in air pollution assessment. So I tend to think of MRV in those terms, just as a heads up. I worked for over a year at the Climate Map as a research scientist, and just last month we integrated into RMI to create a larger CDR initiative to assess the long-term role of CDR and mobilize action on critical projects and priorities to advance the entire ecosystem. Thanks.
Thanks, Kara. Christoph.
Thanks, Naeem, and thanks, Jason and Tito, for setting this up. Great to see a few familiar faces. So I'm Christoph Jaspe. I'm based in Colorado. I'll drop my LinkedIn in the chat to show other background so I can talk about fun points. Like, I got called a used carbon salesman once because I wouldn't shut up about the need to pay for old carbon that's in the atmosphere and pull it back. And actually my career has been one that's moved from carbon exuberance to recovering from carbon exuberance, founding a company called Carbon A-List in 2016. I'll drop another link in the chat, which is my Medium, where you could see blogs all the way back then. I put that on pause in 2017 to co-found Nori, which launched a carbon market, initially serving methodology for US farmers. Prior to Carbon A-List, I was working with Dr. Klaus Lackner and kind of deeply seeped in the direct air capture carbon management space. And I left Nori actually January of last year to step back and breathe life back into Carbon A-List, which, depending on how I count the team, is a team of 10 with consultants and core team members. Glad to see alumna Lori Muzzy here. Hey, Lori. And although the work we do serves the startup, food companies, and farm organization communities, and broadly is framework and methodology development, strategic consulting, and community weaving.
Great, thanks so much, Christoph. Peter.
Hey, everyone, and definitely thank you to the AirMiners team for having me here to talk about such a great topic. My name is Peter. I'm Director of Science and Innovation at Carbon 180. There, I get to do all kinds of fun stuff, including build and run a fellowship program that helped us get to Heirloom and Carbon Plan. I get to contribute to new policies like the ones that we just saw got signed today. But also my team and I have been working for the last few months, getting very obsessive about MRV. And so we plan to be publishing some of our work in the next month or two, but excited to share some of those ideas and just talk about the topic generally today.
That's great. Thanks so much, Peter. And we're excited to get into that. And actually, I'll kick off with you. And again, I think if our panelists can, I'll have some questions directed to individuals, and if you can take each of those questions in stride, that would be great. But I really want to open up the conversation to the whole group for each of these sections. So, kind of focusing on big picture. Peter, what problem is MRV trying to solve? And what does a well-organized MRV system look like?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I'm also very excited to hear what the other panelists think. But in my mind, unequivocally, MRV is the one of the most important components of a flourishing gigaton scale carbon removal industry. And that's because the CDR field faces a really tough engineering problem. And that's the medium that we've decided that we're going to have an effect on, CO2, is an invisible, inert, highly diffuse gas in the atmosphere. And the impacts from any removals that we can successfully do have a really long time constant until we actually can see what happened. And so this means that it can sometimes be very challenging to account for the real metric of success that ultimately matters. And that's how many tons of CO2 have been successfully removed and durably sequestered. That's really the game that we're all trying to play here. And so in my mind, MRV is the set of data, often from standardized practices, that provides confidence in that result and the general outcomes that are being claimed by a carbon removal project. So when designed properly, it also will bring to light when projects aren't as effective as claimed, and they will require some sort of corrective action. But at its core, I think that MRV can be thought of as the accounting and enforcement mechanism for the CDR fields, and making sure that projects actually deliver on the promises that they're making. One thing that is not really talked about often in the CDR industry for now, but is likely to be a big risk, is that MRV, when done right, can also protect against fraud. This is actually one of the big concerns amongst EJ groups that worry that CDR could become a greenwashing tool. One of the best ways to protect against that is to actually produce the outcomes that we say we're going to produce and keep our word. And so to wrap things up around that, I think you take away sort of one single concept of what MRV should be. It's the accountability stack for CDR, not just for buyers of eventual credits, but really should be for all the parties who are involved and have been promised benefits. And that may even include communities where projects are being deployed. I won't get too much into that. Like, we'll be talking more about that at Carbon 180 very soon. But I think the real question you should all be asking is, how do we actually do this? What actually does a well-organized system for MRV actually look like? And I expect many of you were hoping that we were going to sort of give very specific answers, or I would give a very specific answer to this, and maybe even think about how deploying MRV can happen across CDR methods. That's unfortunately a much bigger problem that I definitely don't feel qualified to answer on my own. And my guess is that we may never actually see some grand unifying theory of MRV that spans across CDR. There's really just too much difference in the mechanisms of how CO2 is being captured and stored. But I do think it is possible to establish very clear principles that can be used to describe what high quality MRV looks like. And that is something that can actually be compared across CDR is how do we do the best possible form of MRV? And so some of the things that my team has come up with in the last couple of months is that we think there are 4 core principles to describe this. First is direct accounting of removal from atmosphere. And really what that means is just, how do we actually know that capture is happening? How directly can we actually measure those outcomes and be certain that it's happening in the amount and in the timescales that we think? Second thing is reversal traceability over time. Can we actually measure when reversal happens? How easy is that to do? And how can we do the accounting around that? The third thing is data transparency. So can this MRV scheme be clear about what's being measured, sharing that with all the stakeholders, and doing it on a regular basis so that we can be certain about how things are changing and can take corrective action when needed. And lastly, does it have positive incentive structures? Can it be designed in a way that minimizes corruption and you create the right incentives for folks to actually report bad acting or poor results when they happen? And so I think very likely, like we talk about sometimes MRV as a checkbox that we just need to do. And once it's completed, the project gets paid for any credits that they're selling. But I think the right way to think about it is, how can we think about relative quality of MRV designs and approaches? And we should be putting pressure on producers and on the field in general to be pushing towards higher quality as much as possible. In some cases, it may be very challenging to do that, or maybe even impossible. We may need new technologies before we can actually increase and improve the quality of some types of CDR methods, MRV and certain types of CDR methods. But I think if you think about the goal of why we're all doing this, there's a lot of reasons why we're all interested in feel CDR is important. Some of it very personal, some of it for other reasons. But I think for me, I do CDR because it's a way to try to minimize as much harm as possible, both for people who are here today, but maybe even future generations. And so if we don't really think critically about how we can be as robust as possible around MRV and make sure that the tons that we think we're removing are actually happening and are reducing harm, then why are we even doing this in the first place? So let me stop there. Definitely interested in hearing what other folks think.
Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. I think that really sets a really good stage for this conversation. That's a great big picture perspective on the MRV system. And I love the principles approach because it feels like the right level of abstraction to be relevant, but also comparable across different CDR pathways. And I hope we get a chance to get into that a little bit later on today. I know Christoph had his hand raised. And so why don't I let you chime in, Christoph? How do you, what reaction do you have around some of what Peter just said?
I love what Peter's saying. I also want to share a pet peeve of mine, which is acronyms. And we didn't even define MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification, or in fact, it could be MMRV, measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification. And, you know, if we were to just take the jargon out all entirely, I'd use the word observation to really set the big picture phrase, is that's the problem it's solving, which is giving us certainty and clarity, observing specific, in this case, to CDR activities. And just to throw out more important terms that I think any entrepreneur folks working on this is, what is the value it's providing, is baselines and benchmarks, because it helps you understand that starting point and a hypothetical future state that hopefully the underlying climate finance, which is backed by the rules of observation, or MRV, is ultimately setting up. So I just wanted to kind of layer that in some of the big picture discussion.
Yeah, that's great. Bertha, Kara, anything to add on just what we need to be thinking about as we go forward around the purpose or the problem that MRV is trying to solve?
Yeah, maybe if I go. Yeah, I completely agree with everything Peter has said, and I really like how he set the scene of you know, the importance of MRV, and I think one of the key points is the transparency in terms of, you know, how we measure things, and yeah, how we show them, and also how, you know, how auditable these things are. I think that is a really key point that is very important for CDR. And another point that I think is quite important why MRV would be so key for any carbon removal technology is public acceptance, because I think at the moment the general public is not quite so aware of CDR, and often kind of associated with you know, geophysical things, and like something that's a bit out there, and yeah, not really realistic. And I think now that CDR is becoming more into the spotlight, thankfully, we need to bring public awareness and also, you know, have a positive view of CDR. And I think strong and transparent MRV will be really key for achieving that.
All right, go ahead, Kara.
Yeah. Oh yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I also agree with what everybody's said so far. And I'll just add, and Peter made a comment about MRV not just checking a box, not, you know, I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't a simple problem. There are a lot of different, like, moving parts, and a lot of it's not figured out yet. So the other thing is that it's an ongoing process. It's not a simple thing that's been done, and then you report and verify, and that's it. There's a lot of monitoring that goes on afterwards, or that needs to go on afterwards. And so this is a really big, getting this right will be a really big undertaking. I just wanted to stress that.
Yeah, and I think a big part of getting this right are, you know, governance systems. You know, I'm convinced that MRV systems need to be, you know, designed and executed with a high degree of integrity, transparency, and accountability, without stalling innovation. And I'm worried that we could embark on this journey where incentives maybe don't align so well with some of those principles. So, Kara, in your view, who should be designing MRV protocols, and who decides what's good enough?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I don't have a clear answer to that yet. I don't think there's a clear answer to that yet. I think ideally we'd all like to see some very independent, completely disinterested, scientifically competent third party come in, or multiple third parties, right? Because you want them to check and balance each other and make sure everything is done correctly. But we don't have that. So in reality, a lot of these protocols are developed by the specific projects, and those are the people with the most knowledge about their specific projects, about the conditions under which those projects are being deployed. So it's really hard to see how anyone other than those companies and entrepreneurs developing those projects could design those protocols. I'll say, though, that brings up another issue, which is that some companies and projects might not have the resources to do that. So then you might see an imbalance in who gets to develop CDR projects and who is left out. So the question about who gets to verify these things, like who gets to decide what's good enough, I feel like that's a much harder question. And I feel like it's being increasingly contested. So for example, right now we have a lot of people who are trying to decide, or who are deciding what's good enough. So you've got independent nonprofit registries, you've got the buyers themselves, you've got people advising buyers, you've got the companies, got the media, some government groups, and maybe even other nonprofits. You've got the science-based, I forgot the acronym, the SBTI. So yeah, I think there are lots of pros and cons to having multiple groups deciding, but personally, I'm not really clear on which entity or entities should play that role. I know RMI doesn't have a position on it. The one thing I'll say, though, is that until we can settle that question of who will decide what's good enough, there's going to be a lot of confusion for buyers. That's going to undermine demand and flow of capital into CDR. So I personally think we need we might need new forms of collaboration here, and we might need to find ways for people to engage with each other and reach some level of agreement.
Yeah, it's extremely thorny. It seems to be getting increasingly fragmented, and I'm concerned about the confusion that will create in the CDR market. But before I get to Christoph real quick, I want to pivot over to Berta, because something Kara said was, I think, important around the potential for disinterested parties to get involved in MRV. Carbon Future is a CDR platform and marketplace. How do marketplaces like yours advance high integrity MRV in this kind of non-conflicted way that we'd like to see it done? Is that even something that's realistic?
Yeah. So I mean, I agree with what Kara said, and I would love to see these strong third parties developing methodologies in MRV. That's definitely what is needed there. And in terms of the marketplace and platform, I would separate the two. So I think marketplace, as the role of a marketplace, I see it more as establishing trustworthiness in the credit. So the marketplace will set thresholds for the projects that they take on board and the credits that they sell. So that's sort of the role that I see of a marketplace. So committing to only selling trustworthy credits and providing transparency for the projects that they take on. On the other hand, as a platform, I would say I see it more as the platform doesn't set the rules, but it provides the tools for appropriate MRV. So it implements the MRV. It's an implementation tool and can provide transparency and a tamper-proof measure that is digitally auditable for customers or any auditors, ideally on an immutable or like tamper-proof database, and so that everything is transparent. So I see it more as the marketplaces and platforms are there to support, but I do think that everything with MRV and even standards and methodologies should be developed by third parties, like independent third parties, because otherwise, you lose the integrity of both the platform and marketplaces. And I mean, the approach that we take is we try to support these external efforts of MRV development, but we don't, Carbon Future, we're committed to not developing them in-house because we don't think it makes sense.
I'm curious what folks think, and I'll let Christoph jump in. I know he had his hand up, but is that deconflicted approach, realistic for a company that has a financial incentive in selling, carbon removal credits, to only use things that are kind of reach some kind of threshold of a third-party check mark? I think there's some element of that right now in the system, at least as it relates to carbon offsets, that doesn't seem to be working very well.
I mean, I think there's precedent, and there's nothing wrong. If you're a company generating carbon removal and you want to sell it, you should be able to sell it, but you can't have it both ways. You can't also create the rules under which you're selling it and say, trust me. And that's where, to Berta's point, having third parties is super critical. But I want to evoke a quote from a book, and if you don't read the book, Surveillance Capital, remember this quote. It's who knows, who decides, and then who decides who decides. And there's a limited amount of knowledge in the knowing and deciding. And I believe that the more we open up the knowledge access, the more democratized the whole decision-making process can be. And I'm going to drop something in the chat, which is, I will speak about this as objectively as possible and let you form your own decision as to whether this is good or bad. But the Climate Action Reserve just approved regrow as an acceptable model under the Soil Enrichment Protocol, which is delivering both carbon removal and reduction. Now, regrow is built on top of a DNDC model, which is an MRV tool, and it's a process-based model where there's inputs, project area boundaries, and outputs in terms of carbon removals, reductions, and avoidances. And this model is opaque, and there's an exclusive license by regrow to this specific model that was funded with publicly available data. Is Climate Action Reserve in the right place to even assess the validity of this? Are there other worthy scientists who could provide valid input? You could argue both ways. You could say, sure, they are, because they develop protocols for both voluntary and compliance markets in the California markets as well as, and you could say, this is 10 years behind the science, and there's a multitude of other avenues that similarly could provide improvements. Now, here's the thing. I don't care. As an entrepreneur, I think it's great. I think it's actually wonderful, and we need to see all experiments of different MRV protocols compete in the market in a streamlined way to assess it against each other. But I think that gets to the who decides and how can this evolve as quickly as possible so that there's common pathways. And I think the most important thing is directionality, which currently we're not seeing today. There is not, especially in land-based systems, when you're dealing with like a volumetric flow meter through a direct air capture device, it's quite simple. There's very little subjectivity as to actually how much carbon was taken and then sequestered, and you can follow the math. In land-based systems, if in the absence of directionality and even understanding of where the science is going, I think deciding, in my view, should be as open as possible in less of a pre-competitive space where registries who are blockers today can no longer become the blockers. And I think it goes down to open parameters, open inputs, open ways that we talk around project area boundaries or shapefiles.
Peter, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, just really quickly, I don't think this is what Christoph was actually saying, but one thing I think we do need to be careful about is we should absolutely be doing lots of experiments around MRV to try to figure out how to make this as good as possible. But I do not think that we should be letting the market decide what is right and what is wrong. I think that's actually a really big risk for the field, just because this is very complex. It's extremely hard, and the amount of science knowledge and background you need to have to really get into it is astronomical. I struggle most of the time, and this is my full-time job. And so to ask buyers, most of which are going to be very good-hearted and want to do the right thing, but do not have expectations of this, to decide what MRV is right and to interpret data that is being shared is never going to work. That will be a race to the bottom. And so we do need to think critically as a field. How do we decide what the threshold should be? What is the quality bar, which I know we're about to get into, and how do we communicate that? And who are the observers of this? Long term, my guess, probably governments. In short term, we need to figure out how in private markets, how we decide as a field to communicate what that is, and where are we willing to take risks, and where are risks going to be unwarranted.
Just to respond, Peter, I don't think we're in disagreement. Where I'm pro experimentation to use, let's just say, subpar models to make estimates around carbon removal assets, is that any amount of experimentation is good when the right people understand and can give feedback to it. That's a response mechanism that hopefully elicits better and more confident standards. And it's really tricky because if we had a government body come in and actually lay the rules of the road, that would make everyone's life way easier. In an unregulated market, anybody can slip in, and it's the most idealistic, wonderful people with the biggest scam artists. And that's where I think increasingly the government interest and global interest in voluntary and compliance assets is really important. One of the pieces of work that my firm just finished actually was creating a framework for designing quality assets. And so we looked at an array of different assets, and then we looked at, in the framework, an array of different qualitative and quantitative approaches to that. And part of it, one of the sort of core callouts was clarity, certainty. And if you don't have certainty because no one can understand it in the industry, that it's like probably not a good thing. And again, it goes back to expanding the bucket of people who know, so that we can make the best informed decisions.
Yeah, and actually to get on that, I mean, Christoph, to shift, I guess, or pivot to quality, Carbon A-List, as you mentioned, developed this framework. How can it be, give us a bit of a background on it. How does it apply to carbon removal? Where might it help strengthen MRV quality and CDR pathways, especially where MRV is currently very undeveloped or weak?
Yeah, so I mean, we just shipped this product, and it's really a work in progress to support our clients who are coming to us saying, I'm trying to make a quality asset. And so, for instance, asset efficiency is one of the characters, or one of the framework elements that we looked at. And so that's what's the time and money spent into your entire MRV process so that you can have this provably trustable thing. And you're able to quantify that. You're able to look across the board. So if we're looking at a farmer, for instance, there's an integrated software enrollment platform. There's dozens of these out there. These software enrollment platforms may be plugging into machine learning applications, maybe plugging into process-based models, maybe have a combination of direct measurement to determine soil organic carbon stock change over time. And you can look at the efficiency of that across the board. And we abstracted that out, that we think this approach can be relevant for everything. The trick, and where I said I'm a recovering carbon exuberant, is from my perspective, is actually not about the carbon, unless that is a purely permanent taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and fully store it. But if it is an asset created to producing foods, fuels, or fibers, or other valuable things that we use in our economy today, then it is the most critical subset of data for business intelligence. And that nuance means that with that business intelligence, you have the ability to do science. You have the ability to save on costs. You have the ability to perhaps get different loan products or insurance products, all of these being different asset types. And so it opens up CDR, at least in the natural-based system perspective, especially in agriculture, to look a little more broadly, a little more holistically. And in kind of carbon market speak, it's about stacking benefits. And if it's about stacking benefits, then the MRV, if you will, is not just the carbon removal alone, but it's tracking the more holistic co-benefits that are varied and nuanced, and quite frankly, don't commoditize or scale all that well because it's contextual to a specific area. In some cases, it may be this is an MRV framework and now you have an easier way to get grants, or maybe you don't need to actually prove additionality and permanence, and yet you're still replying and supplying data that's showing this carbon stock is sequestering carbon over time, that data is super valuable to cities. They need to report on it. They don't have that framework or reporting structure. And so this quality approach wasn't, unlike many others, just strictly on the carbon asset, but looking a little more broadly from that perspective.
That's interesting. And I'd be interested to hear what folks think about taking this more holistic view. How does that help? How does that help make carbon removal or MRV or cross carbon removal pathways more comparable, if at all? And Christoph,
I'll jump.
Kara, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, no, I'll jump in. But just to say that I sometimes think about MRV more holistically, but maybe in a different way, because carbon's not the only thing we need to measure. There are a lot of other things we need to measure, if our CDR pathway is potentially leaching contaminants into the soil or into water tables, like those things need to be measured, monitored, reported, and verified as well. So so for me, the holistic system is a group of measurements, all sorts of environmental parameters that could be used by other fields, other teams. In science especially, people are always trying to get their hands on more and better data. But if you're talking specifically about the carbon, if we're measuring like how many tons or people are paying for, then I almost feel like that aspect of it might need to be simplified to just carbon, even though we should be measuring everything.
Yeah, it really comes down to like, what is the purpose of the MRV? Is it, a broader set of, are we trying to do higher level oversight over carbon removal pathways, or are we talking about, selling carbon on a voluntary compliance market? And that has to, I think, play an important role in figuring out the scope of how we do MRV for sure. And Kara, I think I'll pivot to Peter in a second as he has his hand up, but when you think about some of the kind of the data that needs to be collected, the technologies that need to be placed, what do you see as some of the key technologies that are necessary in execution of MRV that probably need more attention and investment in order to kind of help us, improve quality in the way we're talking about?
Yeah, so that's a good point, especially for me. That's how I think about this fundamentally. I think there's a lot to do in terms of measuring the wide range of parameters that we need, because you're not just making one carbon measurement, you're measuring a number of different things. And maybe you can have a direct carbon measurement, but most likely you're measuring, I don't know how many other parameters, and then estimating the carbon based on that. So yeah, it's tough because each CDR method is going to have its own set of parameters. They all need to be measured and calculated in different ways. Yeah, I think there are different aspects of this, I guess, if I can say. One is that we need to get good at measuring all of the things we need to measure, but then we also need to get good at doing that at scale, doing that like over large areas of land or large chunks of rock, whatever it is, large forests. Maybe forests are a good example where people have been moving to satellite-based measurements, because that's a good way to look at everything at once and look at it continuously. So I think that we need more thinking like that, like how are we going to do this? Let's figure out how we do this, but then what sensors do we need? What technology do we need? How do we ensure that it's reliable? How are we going to continually calibrate those sensors? Like all of those questions. But then, like, how do we deploy at scale? And those questions, I think that's not so obvious on how to do.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it totally is. It's an entirely kind of different way to approach the question on innovating in this space, right? I mean, it's one thing to be able to kind of improve MRV systems as it relates to a pilot project, but when we think about scale, the entire set of requirements, I think, definitely change. So that's super important. Peter, did you want to chime in around this quality question?
Yeah, one quick thing I wanted to share, and this will probably be my hot take for the panel, but we as a field talk a lot about the relative quality of carbon removal, what's high quality, what's not. I actually think that's the wrong framing. I don't think there actually is such a thing as high quality carbon removal. The thing we're limited by is what we can measure. How can we actually measure the outcomes? So really all we have is what is the relative quality of MRV? And so I think that tells me two different things. One is that is probably the right way for us to compare CDR methods and where we should be sending relative investment, and what ends up scaling is MRV is probably going to be the right way for us to do that comparison. But the second thing it tells me is it also does a really great job of clarifying where we have gaps. If something is lower quality from an MRV perspective, how can we use innovation to solve that? How can government build infrastructure to make it better? I fundamentally don't believe that there's any CDR method that can't have an extremely high quality MRV process and protocol. I think it is possible across methods, but in many cases, it doesn't exist today. So the right question is, what steps do we need to take, and how do we need to mobilize scientists, funders, entrepreneurs to solve those really critical problems?
Great, that's great. I love a hot take right near the end of our panel. Bertha, I'll let you chime in here.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, what I wanted to say more from, I guess, from seeing the demand for credits, you know, the current demand is like really quite high and keeps growing, and we also see like plenty of, which is super exciting, you know, like plenty of new companies popping up in the CDR sector, and I think we're in this tricky point where like we know what, or we know, well, maybe we don't know, but we know what the aim is into like creating like high quality MRV and what that should look like. But we also know where the gaps are in the science and what is still needed to be researched to achieve that. But I think we also need solutions like for today to like establishing some level of MRV, like baseline MRV to be able to, yeah, set quality standards, so to say, for the CDR that is happening today and what credits are being sold in the market. So I don't know what the other panelists think, but like I see kind of like different levels of MRVs being developed. So like maybe today you can have one like, you know, short term, mid-term, longer term, and maybe having you know, limits in the scale of what you know, each CDR method can reach within, you know, identifying, you know, these are the unknowns, and this is how comfortable we are in certifying X amount for a specific CDR method, because I feel like we need tools immediately, and then also aim for yeah, more perfect MRV, so to say, which I think obviously are, I mean, there's no such thing as perfect. I do think it will always be evolving along with the research and science, but having like a baseline today that can be improved, I think that's quite important. So having the MRV evolve with research. And to touch on what Christoph said, I absolutely agree that we sometimes end up having a bit of a carbon tunnel vision. I absolutely love like systems thinking, and I do think that sometimes when we speak about carbon removal, we might very much focus on carbon, and I mean, I can see why. And when you're like trading assets as like a carbon removal credits, you will focus on the carbon, but yeah, I would love to see MRV systems that actually take into account a more holistic view of CDR and putting a value, which I think is super tricky, putting a value on what co-benefits or just benefits some CDR methods can have, and maybe putting yeah, all the different CDRs on a more level playing field depending on their impacts, like environmentally and even socially. So yeah, I would love to see that for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think just kind of touching on this quality piece, there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of potential for just innovation, you know, just at the pilot level, at scale. And Peter, also really appreciate the framing around quality MRV as opposed to thinking about quality in terms of of specific carbon removal pathways. There's a lot of great insights here, everyone. Thank you so much. This was really educational for me. I appreciate all the perspectives here. I know we're kind of at time to switch over to Q&A. I've seen some really great questions come through. I'll pass over to Jason right now, and maybe he can take us through a few questions.
Sure. Thanks, Naeem. And thanks to your audience, our audience today. Some really great topics that have bubbled up. Question, Michael Leach, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Hey, everyone. I threw this in the chat a few minutes ago, but I was wondering if the panelists could think of any examples of industries or issues where this lack of alignment or clarity on questions of quality has been solved already. I mean, do we have a good roadmap? And I guess part B is, can you think of some bad examples, some scenarios that we should avoid?
I'll hop in there. I got a good example for you. So data centers, as many of you might know, consume a lot of energy. And the data center industry got together and created the PUE, the Power Use Efficiency Index, which was actually a really useful metric that enabled those industries to align around an industry-led standard and make some significant emission reductions. It's obviously more nuanced. And I think to Berta's point, in talking about carbon removal, it has to go methodology by methodology. But there's precedent in things like that.
Great. Great. Siobhan, you had a question about jurisdiction that cropped up.
Sure. Thanks for this great topic, guys. This is really fun, and I love the discourse here. I'm just wondering, coming from a background in MRV professionally, but not in carbon MRV, MRV is dealt with by different jurisdictions. For example, in California, the Department of Wildlife, Department of Fish and Game. I'm wondering if there's any kind of early vision, maybe this is a question for Peter, about who might be the governing jurisdiction around MRV principles, or where would, in our dream scenario, where would the government step in here? Who would it be?
Wow, this is really the right question to ask. And I definitely don't think I have an answer. I think we're still having the conversation of, even from a research perspective, which agency should be looking over what pathways of CDR. And even that's not decided yet. And so I think there could definitely be roles for EPA, since that historically they have looked at emissions generally. But obviously DOE has been one of the biggest funders of carbon removal as a field. And so I don't think I actually know the answer at all. I think that's a big open question that we eventually need to solve.
Anyone else from the panel want to hazard an answer to that?
Sure. I mean, whatever it isn't what we have today, which isn't working. And when I talk to farmers and they sort of allude to, if you had only asked me my opinion, and the fact that by design, farmers aren't invited to the gold standard, creating scope 3 MRV and setting criteria that includes carbon removal, I think is a mistake. And so I think the way to think about any methodology is, before to design, who are all the actors involved? And by answering that actor question, you'll realize there's civil society, there's nonprofits, there's the right government agencies, and there's the people doing the work. And I think often the people who this might most apply to and more affect are left out of the discussion at the, unfortunate, ultimately uptake of methodologies that have came up with MRV schemes.
Got it. Great. Got a question for the panel, actually, about alignment and how to. I think it came up in some regards in the chat earlier about how individual companies might have their own incentive, whereas other bodies would have, say, a scientific incentive. And I think Jeremy Epstein made a comment about how that would never come to pass. Jeremy, do you want to maybe unmute and ask how we can unlock that?
Jason, you put me on the spot while I was trying to get some dishes washed and listen to
Yeah.
this wonderful webinar.
Sorry, man.
Yeah, no, this is great. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this does come down to what are the incentives among various actors, and I think we have it wrong the way that it's done today. And maybe just to expand on that, you look at, what's the inherent incentive for a verification body or the entity looking to, the project developer or the project owner themselves, right? They all seem to have their own disparate incentive structure, and ultimately, I think when you have people, everyone's looking out for themselves in their own best interests. And maybe this is a slightly cynical view, but I don't know, tends to play out in my experience. Things get distorted to enhance each individual actor's gain in the system. And so maybe it's less of a question, more of a statement, but I think the radical transparency is perhaps the best weapon that we have to fight those types of perverse incentives that I think misalign across the system and ultimately end up with a lack of trust in the outcome of a measured ton of carbon or whatever we're trying to measure. So maybe more of a statement, but curious to hear panelists' reactions to that.
I can start. I think if you were to talk to economists or economists, I think what they would tell you is where you get really big problems with corruption and perverse incentives is when folks have the ability to make decisions on what a protocol looks like, but then also have decisions on who they are paying. So it's the coupling of those two things that is the most dangerous. And that's, for example, like we got into a lot of trouble in the mortgage industry, right? Like they got to choose which of the verifiers they're working with, and then we're the ones directly paying them. And so I think what is interesting to me is how can we start to try to uncouple those things? And so one way is that maybe the people who are producing carbon removal are not actually paying for MRV. Maybe that's something that buyers do, or there's some sort of communal way that that's going to be handled. But the other answer is that we do create clearer standards that are outside the purview of the producers themselves. So it's something that they are subject to, either by government regulation or it could be market action. There's a lot of ways that can happen, but I think the key thing is how do you create separation there? And so, yeah, I think just Jeremy, you're 100% right that open and transparent data is the best way forward. But I think we also need to think about the market mechanics of how these systems will also function.
Well, just to give a specific example and, hat tip to Carbon Plan existing as an entity to go through some of the available data to make sense of where CDR has gone well or gone awry. Like as a project developer, you can literally choose the math you want to follow to get rewarded. And in California, a bunch of folks did this and gamed the system, and that worked out for the project developer, that worked out for the person selling the credits. Did it work out for the climate? No, it wasn't even real. And it goes back to the who knows who decides. Now this isn't working. And if it were more transparent about how to create the baseline, or even asking who can create that baseline, under what rules, where are the nuances? Because I think, and this is a regulated market here. So that's where clarity on how people are gaming the system is really important, because otherwise a thing that happens today is registry shopping or model shopping. You are going to run the best possible output to get the most amount of money. That is rational human behavior. And I'm not faulting us for being humans, but I'm saying that's how we work in this very opaque system. And we need more trust, transparency, standards around how these baselines are created. And whoever's regulating the rules of the road needs to be a completely disinterested party in the establishment of those assets. And I guess the feedback to improving it. And it's kind of for me, I don't get why one entity is trying to say we got the answer, because they don't. It's this literally affects everyone on this planet. So as a human being, it should be a public good that we all have access to knowing how this math that's supporting MRV and the assumptions behind it work.
Cool. Last question before we come to time, and we've got about 4 minutes left here. maybe for each of the panelists and maybe for Naeem too. Maybe you can name one thing you learned from our discussion today yourselves.
I think, for me, what was really useful is framing, the purpose of MRV as being kind of critical in how we do it. So whether it's, whether it's for, strict carbon accounting to figure out how much a carbon removal credit should cost, or whether we have kind of a broader level of perspective that we need to kind of fill in, or that there's a number of different factors, and we look at MRV a lot more holistically. And I think getting really clear on what the purpose of MRV is, I think is helpful in figuring out a lot of stuff downstream.
I can go next. I think for me, the biggest learning I had is just how engaged folks are on this idea of MRV. I honestly thought that maybe this could be just something that a bunch of nerds get together and try to bang this out, but actually, like, us being engaged as a community is the best chance we have to actually get this industry right. I really believe that if we could get to a place where we can do high quality MRV and really require that across the board, that is the best shot we have to actually having the impacts on climate that we all think about and really hope for. But on the other side, it's also, this is the biggest risk point that we probably have ever seen, where this could go down the same rabbit holes that previous carbon markets have fallen into and have ultimately failed to have the impacts that they had promised. And so this is the moment for us to decide whether we want this field to be real or not. And so the fact that we have so much engagement, I think, has never made me feel more confident and hopeful.
Kara or Berta?
Kara can go if she wants.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, yeah, what I would say, I learned, well, I learned that we're all quite aligned, it seems, which is great. I think, yeah, I mean, it is great to see the interest, and just from seeing how many people are join this call. I mean, yeah, to echo what Peter just said, like the level of interest in MRV, I think it's really positive, and because it's something that at Carbon Future we're like quite focused on, but we feel like there's not that much that we can do beyond like actually trying to support and boost initiatives, or like try to get initiatives going. So it's great to see that there's a strong interest, and also that it's seen as like something that is really important and key for the CDR sector to actually establish itself as a trustworthy and also transparent sector that learning from the from some of the just learning from the offset markets, let's say. And I think it's a great place to be to establish increased transparency, also more streamlined processes. So traditionally I think MRV is always seen as like something quite tedious and like an ongoing periodic lengthy process, and I think also here we have a chance to have tools that allow for more streamlined and even like live reporting and also verification, and also very happy to see and hear that there's thinking beyond carbon accounting also for co-benefits of carbon removal. I think that's key, and something to think about how it can be implemented and translated in like carbon removal credits, for instance, thinking like with my marketplace cap on.
Yeah, and then I'll just quickly add. I guess I'm not surprised, but it always hits me that there's so many open questions left to be solved. And then I commented earlier on the scale of the problem and that there was so much, so many moving parts. But I feel like through this conversation, that's kind of sunk in even deeper for me. Like every time I have these conversations, it really hits me more and more. Like what a big problem this is, and how crucial it is that we get it right, but how many like how many different aspects of it there are. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for some of the questions that are as yet unanswered, I shared panelist emails if you want to reach out there. Also, please, 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 I would love to hear your comments about what we did right today, what we didn't do right today, how we can improve for next time. I just want to say before we close, thank you so much for attending, especially thank you to those who have contributed voluntarily to make our event today a carbon negative event. Yay, we want to practice what we preach. And much appreciated for your donation. So for your contribution. So there's that. Our next event is going to be on August 31st, talking about decentralized DAC systems. But as Naeem mentioned at the top, we are going to have a follow-up to this event because there was so much interest in MRV. We're going to talk about some of the different pathways along the different methods of CDR, thinking about soil or oceans or mineralization or other ways of doing MRV services. I also shared a couple links to AirMiner stuff. I would love to see you if you are an early stage startup, 1 or 2 or 3 person startup, maybe pre-commercial, maybe pre-funding, to come to our AirMiners, apply to our AirMiners Launchpad. And if you're working in carbon removal, especially in innovating in the sector, including MRV, obviously, feel free to apply to our AirMiners Slack. And we look forward to seeing you there. Our recording will be uploaded in a few days to our AirMiners YouTube channel. But in the meantime, feel free to take a look at our event calendar, and we will see you at our next event in hopefully the one in late August, but definitely the one in September when we will have the MRV follow-up to this event. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Naeem, for an excellent job moderating, and thank you to everybody for attending. Wonderful, wonderful. And I'm going to stop the recording. We're going to start networking soon.